Number 736, Taqiyya Sunrise, more on the Piggyback coup in the Middle East. This program is being recorded on March 6th of the year 2011. Before I get into the main body of the broadcast, increasingly the programs are such, the nature of the programs is such, or are such, the broadcasts are such that you're really going to have to use the website, I think, and the research materials available on it, particularly the descriptions of other programs, because the subject material is getting really dense. The subjects themselves are getting very complicated. So using the website and the various research materials on it, including some of the books that are available, I think is increasingly going to be important for an adequate understanding of what I'm talking about here. I also want to thank those of you who have sent in articles and contributions and other things in the past. If you have sent in an article or a question and have not received a response, don't worry about it. I simply don't have time to answer correspondence by and large. You shouldn't take it personally. It's just a question of doing all the work, maintaining the website, and doing a day job. Just doesn't admit of that. I just don't have time. So please don't take it personally, and certainly don't feel in any way insulted, because it has nothing to do with you. It's just 24/7. There just isn't enough time to do what I do. I make time to do it, but anyway, don't take that personally if you haven't heard from me. Now, speaking of feedback, a couple of comments about For the Record 735, I think, of different nature, but I think they were both true. One fellow offered a bit of constructive criticism. It was criticism, and he described For the Record 735 as messy. And I think that's accurate. It was indeed a messy broadcast, and indeed the series, the reality is getting very messy. But I think for those of you who may have found For the Record 735 frustrating or difficult to handle, yes, I think the callers, the listeners' observation that it was messy was quite accurate. This is an extremely ambitious series, and so if subsequent programs appear messy, please use the descriptions for the programs. The description for the Record 735 has information that was not in the original broadcast, but I think that observation was quite accurate. It was a messy program and part of a messy series, quite frankly. Another listener also proffered some feedback on For the Record 735, and this person said it was one of the best programs I had ever done. I think that was true as well, and I think the series that I'm doing is extremely important. It is both some of the best material I've ever done, some of the most important material I've ever done, and it is also really messy. And, in as much as I put my pants on one leg at a time, if there are some bumps or some places that lack clarification in your opinion, please bear with me. I'm doing the best I can with what I think is not only an extremely complex reality, but a devastating one. And I think the future is being written, yea, verily, as we speak. And I think that it is going to be written in fire and tears and blood and death. To be perfectly frank about it. And I think that what is coming is the triumph of absolute evil. And I think that triumph is going to be in existence for a long time, probably as close to forever as we can conceive of it, barring some sort of significant interference. What I think is taking place in many ways is the culmination of a series of events of which the Second World War and the Cold War were but part. And I think that by the time these events have seen their conclusion, it is not only going to signal the end of the United States, but it is going to bring about the end of the Enlightenment itself and a subsequent dark age and an epic of human suffering unequaled in human history, or unequaled in recorded human history. I can appreciate that sounds like an awful tall glass to drink at one sitting. We're going to be sipping this unsavory brew for a period of time. But again, if this seems messy, it is messy. I think the criticism of 735 was quite valid. It is messy, and the other programs are going to be messy too. They're also some of the best things I've done. Now, talking about messy, we've been talking about WikiLeaks. Let me clarify the term piggyback coup, it may help to make things a little less messy for members of the audience. It's really a twofold reference. One, it refers to the fact that the uprising in Egypt, which successfully ousted Hosni Mubarak, appears to have followed very closely on the uprising in Tunisia. And it also, I believe, so in that sense, the Egyptian uprising was something of a piggyback operation on the Tunisian coup. I also think there is significant evidence. In fact, I'll go farther than that. I think there's overwhelming evidence that, in fact, this is an operation, and that I think two elements of U.S. intelligence and State Department are involved with it, quite possibly an element of British intelligence as well. However, I think that those elements are, in fact, competing elements. In some of our conversations with John Loftus, in particular in For the Record program, I believe it was 704, but some of the ones in 700, we spoke with John Loftus, and we spoke about the Obama administration as the last victim of World War II. And in our discussions with John Loftus, and also in his recent book, America's Nazi Secret, we discussed with John the viewpoint that there are really two U.S. intelligence establishment, something that grew out of events at the end of, or really before the end of World War II, one of which is oriented not towards American interests, but towards transnational corporate interests, and that is inextricably linked with the forces of international fascism, and that is generally identified with the Republican Party, the other of which is more traditionally American, but it, of course, works with the economic establishment, and that is more generally identified with the Democratic Party. I believe that what is going on in the Middle East is, in fact, a U.S., well, it's an operation certainly involving elements of U.S. intelligence, very possibly elements of British intelligence. It is being undertaken on behalf of the transnational corporate community. I think that the Democratic/Obama faction of the State Department and CIA are going along with it. I believe that they are by and large doing so in the naive, and I think it is naive faith, that simply allowing democratic self-expression to Islamist governments in the Muslim world will lead to a peaceful parliamentary resolution of social conflicts there. It's a nice thought. I hope it turns out to be correct. I seriously doubt that it will. I think that sitting right in back of that is a transnational corporate CIA and State Department, which knows full well that the Muslim Brotherhood, which I believe will be the main beneficiary of what is taking place, is in fact corporatist, as Mussolini called his fascist system in their outlook, and that if ideally I think they would like to see some sort of nonviolent resolution of events, but as long as the Muslim Brotherhood is pro-business, and they are definitely that, I think they're quite satisfied to have the Brotherhood in power in the Muslim world. It will ensure corporatism, plus I think they see the Brotherhood as long-term vehicles against Russia, whose petroleum-producing areas are largely inhabited by Muslim populations, such as the Caucasus, and also China, which is increasingly becoming a large player on the global stage, is making a bid for many of the natural resources in the Middle East and Muslim world, including and especially oil. And time permitting, maybe in the next broadcast, we'll briefly examine these uprisings in the Middle East as the possibility of a U.S.-China proxy oil war, but more about that later. I think that Piggyback Coup, in addition to alluding to the fact that the Egyptian uprising piggybacked on the Tunisian uprising, also alludes to the fact that the democratic, quote, parliamentary, unquote, character of many of these social uprisings, I think may very well give rise to Islamic fascism and an ascension of the corporatist Muslim Brotherhood, which I believe is the focal point and the beneficiary of a major operation undertaken by both factions of U.S. intelligence, one of the mistaken and I think ultimately devastatingly tragic belief that things will work out just fine if we just allow them a little democracy, the other of which is perfectly willing to have an Islamic fascist entity in charge of much of the Earth Island, including the petroleum-producing areas. Now, another messy area, of course, in this entire analysis, which really began talking about WikiLeaks back in, with For the Record 724, with Wiki of the Damned, that is that WikiLeaks itself, I think before we plunge into the Piggyback Coup and analysis of same, WikiLeaks itself is one of the strangest darn things I have ever seen. First of all, Julian Assange, as I've said before, is just a real strange bird. I mean, he'd make a very good James Bond villain. He'd be perfect for a character who came out of the old Outer Limits TV series, a man from the future or from Atlantis or from outer space or from another dimension or something along those lines. The guy just flat out looks strange. There are increasing, and I think the questions about Julian Assange's participation in the Hamilton Burn cult loom larger and larger. When one studies that cult, it certainly appears to be a fascist mind control cult with some very strong Nazi leanings. They stress breeding and heredity as essential elements. And again, in 724, summing up very quickly, Assange himself had an encounter with this powerful cult, which certainly appears to be intelligence-connected. They practice a brutal, rigorous form of mind control in which the children in the cult are sleep-deprived, sensory-deprived, and then given large doses of LSD, and then sexually molested and tortured while under LSD after having been sleep-deprived and sensory-deprived. And as you might imagine, that results in some pretty messed up little kids. The kids all have their hair dyed an identical platinum blonde / white, and the kids have multiple identities and multiple passports, raising the very real question of just exactly who Julian Assange actually is. Some critics have claimed that he is living in luxury or has been living in luxury in South Africa. That would possibly be a different person using that name, or is the person that we're seeing not the real Julian Assange. In any event, the WikiLeaks phenomenon itself is strange. Not only is Julian Assange strange, not only are the questions about his participation in the Hamilton Burn cult very strange. Again, he claims that he was fleeing from the cult, but a careful reading of the accounts of his encounter with them suggests that it is possible that, in fact, what was taking place was the creation of a legend. Supposedly his mother was fleeing from the cult and kept going to the same places and telling people where she was going, so the cult kept catching up with her. Well, that could mean that she lacked resources or imagination, or it could be sort of like the creation of a legend, like all the people running around the South in the early 60s, calling themselves Lee Harvey Oswald and doing things that would help to create the legend of Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone nut communist assassin of President Kennedy. Again, Julian Assange is a strange fellow. The WikiLeaks phenomenon itself is a very strange phenomenon. We're seeing all of these State Department memos, State Department cables being bandied about by the press all over the world. One of the things I wonder about is, first of all, where is this stuff coming from? Are the State Department's computer banks so completely porous that any hacker can just move in and begin accessing State Department material? Or is this being deliberately leaked to WikiLeaks? I suspect that may be the case, and I suspect that the Bush/Rove faction of the State Department, again, the Republican/transnational/underground Reich faction of our intelligence system and State Department, may very well be behind this. But simply on its surface, we're seeing all of these State Department memos being bandied about. One of the things that strikes me as a researcher is what sort of quality control is being exercised about these, quote, memos, unquote, or, quote, cables, unquote. Does The Guardian, do the New York Times, do these various publications have experts who can distinguish a skilled forgery of a State Department cable from an actual State Department cable? Perhaps, but I question that. I seriously doubt that WikiLeaks has such an expert. But again, I wonder about the vetting of this material. What sort of quality control exists? How can we tell that these memos, these cables are actually real cables or skilled forgeries? And where is the stuff coming from? Who's leaking it? Or is it really possible for hackers to just access State Department computers this readily? If so, what other things are being accessed? Could be very interesting indeed. But I think one bit of information is really beginning to sort itself out, and that is just the real nature of Julian Assange. This past week, an imbroglio has exploded into the media. It's been eclipsed by events in the Middle East. But Julian Assange, in my opinion, is beginning to demonstrate his real character, and that real character is absolutely consistent with the Nazi viewpoint that is to be found in the associates of Carl Lundstrom, one of the financiers at the epicenter of what I call the pirate vortex. That's Pirate Bay, the pirate parties, and associated elements. And as I've stressed before, the people who use Pirate Bay, the pirate parties, the anonymous folks, are anything but fascist. In fact, they would probably be described as anarcho-utopian, to coin a phrase. They're youthful idealists. They're also, however, being very cynically used, in my opinion, after having been very cynically and expertly misled. And they're being used by the likes of Karl Rove and Carl Lundstrom. I've also noted, in addition to the fact that WikiLeaks landed in the middle of the Lundstrom-financed pirate vortex, the fact that the fellow handling WikiLeaks operations vis-a-vis Russia, which is really important, is basically a celebratory anti-Semite and Holocaust denier named Joran Jermas, who writes under the name, quote, Israel Shamir, unquote. And his son, a fellow named Johannes Wallstrom, is handling WikiLeaks operations for Scandinavia, and he is of the same political stripe. Israel Shamir has stated publicly, quote, it is the duty of all good Christians and Muslims to deny the Holocaust, unquote. And he is part and parcel to the same Swedish anti-Semitic and Nazi milieu as Carl Lundstrom, as we've looked at in, among other programs, For the Record 732. Well, this has been the focal point of criticism from a number of elements. And this past week, Julian Assange, this Latter-day Saint who is the apple of the eye of the likes of Michael Moore and Daniel Ellsberg and is being oozed on by the liberals and progressives around much of the world, Julian Assange has begun to reveal his true character, in my opinion. Article from the New York Times of March 1st of 2011. Report says Assange complains of Jewish smear campaign by Ravi Samaya. It reads in part, he, Assange, was especially angry about a private eye report that Israel Shamir, an Assange associate in Russia, was a Holocaust denier. Mr. Assange complained that the article was part of a campaign by Jewish reporters in London to smear WikiLeaks. A lawyer for Mr. Assange could not immediately be reached for comment, but in a statement later released on the WikiLeaks Twitter feed, Mr. Assange said Mr. Hislop had, quote, distorted, invented, or misremembered almost every significant claim and phrase, unquote. The Private Eye article quoted Mr. Assange as saying the conspiracy was led by The Guardian, that's the British Guardian, and included the newspaper's editor Alan Rusbridger and investigations editor David Lee, as well as John Kampfner, a prominent London journalist who recently reviewed 2 books about WikiLeaks for the Sunday Times of London. When Mr. Hislop pointed out that Mr. Rusbridger was not Jewish, Mr. Assange countered that The Guardian's editor was, quote, sort of Jewish, unquote, because he and Mr. Lee, who was Jewish, were brothers-in-law. Well, this is the response that Julian Assange issued to the criticism of his having selected, again, an overt, celebratory anti-Semite and Holocaust denier, and Joran Jermas, a.k.a. Israel Shamir, again, is a celebratory Holocaust denier. He is also fiercely anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. And it's interesting that he's been handling WikiLeaks operations vis-a-vis Russia because it was disclosure of the alleged State Department cables criticizing the Russian government that led to a fairly acerbic response on the part of Mr. Putin and the remarkable experience of seeing Vladimir Putin appearing on Larry King in order to respond to the criticism. Again, these are strange times, are they not, folks? We got WikiLeaks, we got State Department cables being used for toilet paper all over the world in the bathrooms of just about every newspaper and blog outfit and around the world. And we've got Vladimir Putin appearing on Larry King, apparently because he knows that Larry King isn't going to ask him any tough questions. But these are very strange times indeed. Back to Julian Assange. Again, rather than take stock of the criticism, he has defended Israel Shamir and claimed that the negative publicity that WikiLeaks has gotten from hiring Shamir and his son to handle very sensitive positions for WikiLeaks, that this is part of a, quote, Jewish conspiracy, unquote. When you hear that kind of BS, the Jewish conspiracy stuff, that should lead you to sniffing the air, folks, because that is how Nazis talk. And if you study, by the way, the Anne Hamilton Byrne cult, they really do give evidence of being sort of a quasi-Nazi cult, perhaps some sort of British Commonwealth intelligence Nazi outfit. I don't know past a point. But again, I think take a look at the picture on the front page of the SpitfireList.com website, and take a look at a picture of a member of the Anne Hamilton Byrne cult. There is one of them who looks very much like Julian Assange. Again, not being an expert in photo analysis, I can't state without qualification that it is, but there certainly is a distinct resemblance, and if there is anyone out there who has some real skills in photo analysis, I would certainly appreciate their assistance in helping to determine whether or not that really is Julian Assange as a boy. And in general, for providing depth for the discussion of Julian Assange and the Hamilton Byrne cult, do look at the picture that's linked, the post that's linked on the front page of the SpitfireList.com website. Now, transitioning to events in the Middle East from discussion of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and his defense of his hiring of a couple of Holocaust deniers and Nazi fellow travelers to handle sensitive positions for WikiLeaks. He blames that on an international Jewish conspiracy. One of the things that emerged and in the uprisings and the turmoil that's taking place in the Middle East was the leak by WikiLeaks and then of supposedly WikiLeaks using an Al Jazeera using a WikiLeaks leaked document that talked about the negotiations that had taken place between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and both the spokespersons for the Palestinian Authority and spokespersons for Israel are claiming that what was actually broadcast on Al Jazeera, which, as we've seen in past broadcasts, is heavily influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, what they're claiming is that what was released by Al Jazeera or what may have been released, doctored by WikiLeaks in leaking it to Al Jazeera, was fundamentally incorrect. Both the Israeli and Palestinian Authority spokespersons are claiming that the released information is fundamentally inaccurate in that it distorts what was actually taking place. But the nature of the leak is such that it makes the Palestinian Authority appear to have completely capitulated to Israeli demands, thereby discrediting the Palestinian Authority in the eyes of many Palestinians and Arabs and lending strength and support to Hamas, which is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and whose charter we have read in the past. I think looking at this report against the background of Al Jazeera's deep involvement with the Muslim Brotherhood, and also against the background of the significant involvement of WikiLeaks with Holocaust deniers, anti-Semites, and Nazi fellow travelers, the following is more than a little interesting, and also the effect that this may have on Arab public opinion in the wake of these uprisings it's something we're going to ponder. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle of January 25th of 2011. It's an AP story by Ben Hubbard and Mohammed Daragmeh. It's from Ramallah in the West Bank. Its headline, Middle East, Palestinians slam Al Jazeera over disputed report. It reads in part, a senior Palestinian official condemned Qatar-based Al Jazeera on Monday, and a crowd of protesters vandalized the satellite channel's West Bank headquarters after it reported on leaked documents that claimed Palestinian leaders offered large concessions in peace talks with Israel in 2008. The angry outburst followed the airing late Sunday of what Al Jazeera said were internal Palestinian documents showing that Palestinian leaders had offered broad concessions on two of the thorniest issues in negotiations with Israel, Jerusalem and the fate of Palestinian refugees. Yasser Abed Rabbo, a top aide to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, told reporters Monday that the news network engaged in media games to trick and mislead the simple citizen. He angrily accused the Gulf state of Qatar, which bankrolls the station, of damaging Palestinian interests. Quote, what Al Jazeera is doing today is an attempt to distort the national position of the Palestinian leadership, he said. Abed Rabbo said the report on the so-called Palestine Papers relied on out-of-context quotes, insinuations, and outright fabrications. Comparing the program to WikiLeaks, which he said merely publishes leaked documents, he said Al Jazeera could, quote, draw conclusions, counterfeit documents, and change texts, cut a word here and there, and put together images of people with no relationship to negotiations, unquote. I would suggest, how does anybody know that WikiLeaks doesn't do the same thing? And also, although it's not in this account, I've seen allegations that, in fact, these Palestinian papers came from WikiLeaks. That is not in this article. Let's put a question mark by that. I'll see if I can find firmer documentation for that. But we'll put a question mark beside that for the time being. But I would suggest that exactly that same question should be asked about WikiLeaks. I don't doubt that at least some of that material is genuine, but where is it coming from? And what sort of quality control process is being exercised here? Continuing, Abed Robo also took aim at the Emir of Qatar, calling the program a political campaign of the first degree, coming from a political decision at the highest level from our brother in Qatar. The Qatari government bankrolled Al Jazeera when it began in 1996 and is believed to still fund the station. And as we looked at, and among other programs, the description, for the record, 735 and the description, in fact, there is a profound relationship between Al Jazeera and the Muslim Brotherhood. And with the popular uprisings taking place in the Middle East, it will be interesting to see what happens vis-a-vis the whole situation in terms of Arab-Israeli relations. I am not in the least little bit optimistic in the fact that the right wing is in political power in Israel with Benjamin Netanyahu, the heir to the Likud fascists in the Zionist movement, and with Avigdor Lieberman, an ultra-nationalist with a strong political contingent on his side. I don't think, let's just say I'm not optimistic at all. I think the very worst elements are already in power in Israel, although that is potentially subject to change if the parliamentary coalition there dissolves. And it looks to me like the very worst elements are going to be coming to power in the Middle East, too. Hopefully not. Hopefully this will be a genuine democratic manifestation, but I am not optimistic. And one of the reasons I'm not optimistic was voiced by Thomas Friedman in a column that was syndicated from the New York Times. The San Jose Mercury News of February 24th carried this column. It's called Arab World's Transition to Democracy, No Picnic. It reads in part, a Middle East quarterly report in the fall of 2002 detailed the key evidence. Gross domestic product of the entire Arab world combined was less than that of Spain. Per capita, and by the way, this from a group of people that have control of the greatest source of wealth and power in the industrialized world, oil. Per capita expenditure on education in Arab countries dropped from 20% of that in industrialized countries in 1980 to 10% in the mid-1990s. In terms of the number of scientific papers per unit of population, the average output of the Arab world per million inhabitants was roughly 2% of that of an industrialized country. When the report was compiled, the Arab world translated about 330 books annually, 1/5 of the number that was translated into Greek. Out of 7 world regions, the Arab countries had the lowest freedom score in the late 1990s in the rankings of Freedom House. Remember Freedom House, we're going to come back to that. At the dawn of the 21st century, the Arab world had more than 60 million illiterate adults, the majority of whom were women. Yemen could be the first country in the world to run out of water within 10 years. Oh, that is going to be a lot of fun. But again, noting that the 22 Arab countries, despite the fact that they control effectively the greatest source of wealth and power in the industrialized world, had a combined gross domestic product less than that of Spain. And basically, these sorts of things, and as Friedman has noted, the lid is being blown off an entire region with frail institutions, scant civil society, and virtually no democratic traditions or culture of innovation. Yes, indeed, and we're going to see what happens with that, and we're going to see what happens with elements like Al Jazeera and the Muslim Brotherhood stirring up the pot, perhaps with a generous assist from WikiLeaks. However, we're going to be doing that over a considerable period of time, starting in Side 2. On Side 1, I did not explain a key term for understanding the title of the broadcast, and that is Taqiyya. I may be mispronouncing that, by the way. It's most often transliterated from Arabic into English, Taqqiya, sometimes Iyah. I can't say that I've ever heard it spoken aloud. I pronounce it Taqiyya. It may be Taqiyya, I'm not sure, but the reference to Taqiyya sunrise alludes to the principle of Taqiyya, basically to summarize and encapsulate. It is a principle of Islamic struggle and warfare which mandates that when Muslims are engaged in a struggle or warfare with non-Muslims, they are required, as a matter of religious dogma, to lie to the non-Muslims about matters of importance. The precedence was one of the episodes of the Quran in which Muhammad was engaged in a series of military campaigns against the Jews, and I've forgotten whether it was Mecca or Medina, but with regard to one of those groups that he was fighting, he signed a peace treaty and then basically doubled back on the peace treaty and wiped them out, conquered them anyway, and I believe pretty much wiped them out. That is the precedent, I guess one could say, the theocratic precedent for the principle of Taqiyya, but it is an absolutely essential thing to understand when assessing the Muslim Brotherhood, again an Islamic fascist organization dating to the pre-World War II period and allied with the Axis in World War II, then utilized by elements of Western intelligence, including British intelligence and the CIA, for anti-communist purposes in the Cold War. Unfortunately, that Islamic fascist group has given rise to elements that have pursued the United States with a vengeance as well, such as Al-Qaeda. The reason why I'm using the term Taqiyya sunrise is because I think that not only is the Muslim Brotherhood continuing to practice Taqiyya, deliberate deception about what their actual goals and aims are, but I believe that that element of U.S. intelligence and the State Department that is supporting the Piggyback coup in the Middle East is in fact supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and their Taqiyya. We're going to analyze some of the actual apparent hands-on elements in launching the coup later on in this side. I have seen in the media several articles which indicate to me that what Frank Wisner, that's Frank Wisner Sr., termed the Wurlitzer, the CIA's media component, is in fact turning on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood. By the way, Frank Wisner Jr. had been the Obama administration's sort of emergency envoy to Mubarak and actually wound up countermanding Obama administration policy vis-a-vis Mubarak. He advised Mubarak to stay in office and said it would be a good thing if he stayed in office. In fact, as we looked at in For the Record program 734 and 735, it appears that this coup was actually supported. These uprisings were supported by elements of U.S. intelligence and state, and that this operation was begun during the closing years of the Bush administration and carried through by the Obama administration. I believe Obama was maneuvered in such a way as to take the blame, not only for losing the Middle East, but for a whole lot of other things as well. But again, I'm seeing indications that the Wurlitzer, the intelligence community's media establishment in this country, are active on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood and their principle of Taqiyya, deliberate deception for the purposes of achieving advantage over opponents. There was an op-ed column of a very revealing nature that appeared in the New York Times, which is the CIA's #1 propaganda asset. The New York Times is very much worth reading, but it should be read critically, as should everything else. And when you see these sorts of op-ed columns appearing in the New York Times, what you're looking at, folks, is the Wurlitzer. And this is an op-ed column from February 8th of 2011 by Tariq Ramadan. Tariq Ramadan is the son of Saeed Ramadan, head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the son-in-law of Hassan al-Banna, the Muslim Brotherhood's founder. And what Tariq Ramadan is talking about here is how we shouldn't be afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power and how moderate they are. And he is basically sounding a theme that has been echoed throughout the media, which is that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood will be pursuing a path very similar to the Turkish AK party of Mr. Erdogan, and that they're moderate Islamists and we shouldn't worry about that. We're actually going to take a look at Mr. Erdogan's political roots and the real nature of his AK party later. But let's start with this column by Tariq Ramadan. And Tariq Ramadan is the darling of the so-called progressives. He's currently holding forth as something of a visiting scholar at Oxford University. He is, again, viewed with great favor by the so-called progressive sector in the United States and Europe, and they've fairly oozed all over this guy from the moment he first made his appearance. He's a very telegenic fellow, very photogenic, very articulate, and he knows how to play the media, but he is a Muslim Brotherhood fascist of the first order and gives very significant indications of same when you read what he writes or listen to what he says very carefully. By the way, coming up, we're going to be visiting, I hope, with Paul Berman, the author of a very important book that lays bare Tariq Ramadan. It's called Flight of the Intellectuals, and it's well worth reading. And for those who might be inclined to take Tariq Ramadan at face value, that book is invaluable. We will certainly be accessing material from that book and hopefully interviewing the author in weeks to come. But now again, check out this column by Tariq Ramadan. It's called Wither the Muslim Brotherhood. And by that, he doesn't mean that it's withering. He means which direction. Skipping down in the column, we see the following. This is Tariq Ramadan's encapsulated history of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, was an Islamic fascist organization allied with the Axis in World War II. And let's see what Ramadan has to say about it. The Muslim Brothers began in the 1930s as a legalist, anti-colonialist, and non-violent movement that claimed legitimacy for armed resistance in Palestine against Zionist expansionism during the period before World War II. The writings from between 1930 and 1945 of Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Brotherhood, show that he opposed colonialism and strongly criticized the fascist governments in Germany and Italy. He rejected use of violence in Egypt, even though he considered it legitimate in Palestine in resistance to the Zionist Stern and Irgun terror gangs. He believed that the British parliamentary model represented the kind closest to Islamic principles. Long story made short, this is a blatant, bald-faced lie. Period. There isn't a grain of truth to this. There is nothing non-violent about the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, part of their mission statement, so to speak, was that their highest goal was dying in the service of Islam. They did not reject violence in Egypt. In fact, they were scheduled to rise up in Egypt just before Rommel's Africa Corps arrived. And in fact, as Paul Berman goes into at great length, as we've talked about in many of our past programs, but in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood and Hassan al-Banna conspired directly, not only with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, but through them with the SS themselves. They had actually set up an Einsatzgruppe, and the Einsatzgruppe in Egypton, or Egypt, to go in and exterminate the Jews living in Egypt and the Middle East after the proposed Nazi conquest of that part of the world. Very simply put, to maintain that the Brotherhood rejected violence is a lie. To say that they strongly criticized the fascist governments in Germany and Italy is a flat-out bald-faced, stinking lie. There's not a grain of truth to this. And he didn't reject the use of violence in Egypt. He endorsed it. And he also says that he claimed legitimacy for armed resistance in Palestine against Zionist expansionism in the period before World War II. In fact, his son-in-law, Saeed Ramadan, the father of Tariq Ramadan, was deeply involved in the 1948 war as well. One of the things that's so significant about this is not that Tariq Ramadan would lie in his teeth. He's expert at that and practiced at it. But that the New York Times, as far as I can tell, has not printed any of the critical responses to this column. Certainly on the Internet, there's been considerable discussion of people who wrote letters criticizing this outright lie, but did not have those letters printed by the New York Times. Skipping down, there's another significant aspect to the column here by Tariq Ramadan. Today's Muslim Brotherhood draws these diverse visions together, but the leadership of the movement, those who belong to the founding generation are now very old, no longer fully represents the aspirations of the younger members who are much more open to the world, anxious to bring about internal reform and fascinated by the Turkish example. The Turkish AK Party is the example that many people who are apologists for the Muslim Brotherhood have been citing, saying basically that this is the way the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood will go, and that it's a nice moderate organization, blah, blah, blah. More about the nature of the AK Party and its relationship to the Muslim Brotherhood in a few minutes. But again, in addition to that absolutely disgusting op-ed column by Tariq Ramadan, not disgusting so much that he lies in his teeth, because again, that's pretty much what he does. Paul Berman has laid bare the deceptions of Tariq Ramadan, and how, despite his moderate rhetoric, if you actually follow his scholarly references, one comes across a very different Tariq Ramadan than the one that is represented, basically, in the glowing reviews that the progressive sector has heaped on him. There is another column that indicates, again, that the quote, establishment, unquote, the power structure, the Wurlitzer, as Frank Wisner Sr. called it, has basically allied themselves. They're certainly looking to a Muslim Brotherhood ascension, and they're getting ready to be comfortable with that. From the Washington Post of Friday, March 4th of 2011, this is by Scott Wilson. Obama administration prepares for possibility of new post-revolt Islamist regimes. Now, we were being told, remember, that the Islamists were not going to come to power in these countries. Now we're being told, well, maybe they will, but that's not so bad. In other words, basically what they were telling us initially is not true. This article reads in part, the Obama administration is preparing for the prospect that Islamist governments will take hold in North Africa and the Middle East, acknowledging that the popular revolutions there will bring a more religious cast to the region's politics. The administration is already taking steps to distinguish between various movements in the region that promote Islamic law and government. An internal assessment ordered by the White House last month identified large ideological differences between such movements as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and al-Qaeda that will guide the U.S. approach to the region. And skipping down, by the way, of course, al-Qaeda is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. I view the ideological differences between al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood very much like the ideological differences between the Movimento Sociale and the Alleanza Nazionale, the mainstream Italian fascist movements in post-World War II Italy, and the Ordine Nuovo of Pino Rauti, who said of the MSI and the Alleanza Nazionale, quote, too many double-breasted suits, not enough cudgels, unquote. And yet, Pino Rauti, a veteran of the Salo Republic, the SS rump government in northern Italy at the end of World War II, was part of Silvio Berlusconi and Gianfranco Fini's coalition in the early part of the last decade. I view the split in the rhetorical and apparent ideological split between the two in a very similar fashion. There are, in fact, ideological disputes and splits between fascist elements, sometimes quite bloody, but I don't view the al-Qaeda Muslim Brotherhood divergence as all that significant. Skipping down in this article, in the Arab Middle East, those traditions include Islam, although Obama did not directly address the religion's role in democratic politics. He did say the United States, quote, will welcome all elected peaceful governments provided they govern with respect for all their people. The goal of Islamist movements after taking power is at the root of concern expressed by Republican lawmakers and others in Washington. Now, here's the voice of the power structure, and I believe the voice of the twin factions of CIA and State Department. It's a guy named Paul Pillar, or Pillar, Pillar, former CIA analyst who now teaches at Georgetown University, which not only has very close links with State Department and the intelligence system, but which also has a think tank funded by Prince Al-Walid of the Muslim Brotherhood called the Foundation for Christian Muslim Understanding. Now, there's no Jews in there, just Christians and Muslims. Continuing with the article, Paul Pillar, a longtime CIA analyst who now teaches at Georgetown University, said, quote, most of the people in the intelligence community would see things on this topic very similarly to the president. That is, political Islam as a very diverse series of ideologies, all of which use a similar vocabulary, but all quite different. The main challenge President Obama will face is a political challenge from across the aisle and one reinforced by Israel, said Pillar, whose portfolio included the Middle East. Indeed, after the 2010 midterm elections, we saw Netanyahu, basically Israel's answer to Richard Nixon, as far as I can tell, touring the United States and sort of chatting up the Republicans and indicating that the Israel lobby would throw its support to the Republican side of the aisle if Obama did not distance himself from some of the things they wanted him to distance himself from. That is going to be yet another unsavory mixture. The GOP right-wing Israel lobby confluence, which is something that I think we can expect to see, is going to be yet another factor in gumming up politics here. But again, I think the corporate establishment in this country and both the pro-American, pro-democrat, pro-democracy faction of CIA and State Department, the weaker and minority faction, and the pro-transnational corporatist, pro-fascist, and pro-underground Reich faction. The faction allied with Republicans is the dominant side, and I believe that they're working together on this coup, undertaken during the closing phase of the Bush administration, leaked, by the way, courtesy of WikiLeaks, to the world, if in fact we can believe what they say. And the Obama administration has carried on this operation as well. In order to understand, again, why the corporate establishment and why state and CIA would want to see the Brotherhood in power, first of all, to an extent, they're victims of their own propaganda. They've been studying bogus history for so long that the actual history of many of the events that are studied by prospective CIA analysts, State Department functionaries, are actually historical lies that have become institutionalized in this country. But the bottom line is, and by the way, by the time this program airs on the various stations that carry the broadcast, people will have heard rebroadcasts of, for the record, 455 and 354, dealing with the Bank al-Taqwa and the Muslim Brotherhood and Ahmed Huber. It's worth noting that the Muslim Brotherhood has a corporatist economic philosophy and that it is viewed with great favor by the transnational corporate community. We're going to read an excerpt from an article called Islam in Office by Stephen Glane, published in Newsweek's issue of July 3rd through 10th of 2006. In the days of the Caliphate, Islam developed the most sophisticated monetary system the world had yet known. Today, some economists cite Islamic banking as further evidence of an intrinsic Islamic pragmatism. Though still guided by a Quranic ban on riba or interest, Islamic banking has adapted to the needs of a booming oil region for liquidity. In recent years, some 500 Islamic banks and investment firms holding $2 trillion in assets have emerged in the Gulf states, more in Islamic communities of the West. British Chancellor of the Exchequer Gordon Brown wants to make London a global center for Islamic finance and elicits no howl of protest from fundamentalists. How Islamists might run a central bank is more problematic. Scholars say they would manipulate currency reserves, not interest rates. Note the following. The Muslim Brotherhood hails 14th century philosopher Ibn Khaldun as its economic guide. Anticipating supply-side economics, Khaldun argued that cutting taxes raises production and tax revenues, and that state control should be limited to providing water, fire, and free grazing land, the utilities of the ancient world. The World Bank has called Ibn Khaldun the first advocate of privatization. His founding influence is a sign of moderation. If Islamists in power do ever clash with the West, it won't be over commerce. No, indeed. Now, reviewing quickly and supplementing an element that we looked at in For the Record 735, one of the people who emerged as one of the leaders of the uprising in Egypt was a Google marketing executive named Wael Ghonim. I may be mispronouncing his last name. He was a fellow, again, a marketing executive with Google, which maintains close relationships with the intelligence establishment in this country. And this guy was one of the leaders of the uprising in Egypt. A colleague of mine pointed out, a person who has some time to watch television and had been studying him, that his rhetoric in the many interviews he gave sounds very much like Muslim Brotherhood rhetoric. In fact, he was talking about how he transferred his property into his wife's name and was expecting to be martyred. And again, this colleague, expert in such matters, noted that the rhetoric of Wael Ghonim, whether or not he is Muslim Brotherhood, made it sound like he may very well be Muslim Brotherhood. He has that sort of martyrdom rhetoric about him. I would also note that the very same Egyptian embassy which was meeting with members of the April 6th movement during the closing phases of the Bush administration was also meeting with members of the Egyptian Muslim Muslim Brotherhood in a similar time frame. And we also noted in For the Record 735 that one of the people teaching at American University in Cairo, which was attended by Wael Ghonim, is a fellow named Saad Eddin Ibrahim, who is a major spokesperson for Islamist moderates, unquote. We're going to review that, and we're also going to take a look at another aspect of this. Now, Saad Eddin Ibrahim is basically the head of the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development, which is at Cairo for Development Studies, the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies at American University in Cairo. It's named for the Muslim Brotherhood's economic philosopher, who again is viewed as just a wonderful fellow by the World Bank and the transnational corporate community. Again, reviewing. Anticipating supply-side economics, Khaldun argued that cutting taxes raises production and tax revenues and that state control should be limited to providing water, fire, and free grazing land, the utilities of the ancient world. The World Bank has called Ibn Khaldun the first advocate of privatization. Basically, Ibn Khaldun was the Milton Friedman of the caliphate. I mean that literally. He basically is the Milton Friedman. He's the right-wing economic philosopher of choice for the Muslim Brotherhood. And Saad Eddin Ibrahim heads up the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development at American University in Cairo, and on the board of directors of Saad Eddin Ibrahim's Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies is none other than Gamal al-Banna, the brother of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. In an introduction to an article we excerpted in 735 from Dissent magazine, a quarterly of the spring of 2007, Saad Eddin Ibrahim. This is one of the projects we are working on in the Ibn Khaldun Center. On our board of trustees is Gamal al-Banna, the only surviving brother of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brothers. He is in his mid-80s, but lucid of mind. And then the interview reviewing very quickly that we had an excerpt of this. Alan Johnson, you've argued for an alliance of sorts between Democrats and moderate Islamists. In August of 2006, you wrote that mainstream Islamists with broad support developed civic dispositions and services to provide are the most likely actors in building a new Middle East. And skipping down, he calls for a policy of dialogue with Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Muslim Brothers. Again, that can be excerpted. That is in the description for the record 735. Now, taking a look as best we can, given the limited amount of time that we have left. And this is yet another messy broadcast, and it's going to go directly into yet another messy broadcast, which is going to be For the Record 737. But talking about the uprising in Egypt, one of the central figures is a non-violent theoretician named Gene Sharp. From the New York Times, Shy U.S. Intellectual Created Playbook Used in a Revolution by Cheryl Gay Stolberg, New York Times of February 16th of 2011. Talking about Gene Sharp. When the nonpartisan International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which trains democracy activists, slipped into Cairo several years ago to conduct a workshop, among the papers it distributed was Mr. Sharp's 198 Methods of Nonviolent Action, a list of tactics that range from hunger strikes to protest disrobing to disclosing identities of secret agents, unquote. Dalia Ziada, an Egyptian blogger and activist who attended the workshop and later organized similar sessions on her own, said trainees were active in both the Tunisia and Egypt revolts. She said that some activists translated excerpts of Mr. Sharp's work into Arabic and that his message of attacking weaknesses of dictators, unquote, stuck with them. Now listen to the following name. Peter Ackerman, a one-time student of Mr. Sharp who founded the Nonviolent Center and ran the Cairo workshop, cites his former mentor as proof that, quote, ideas have power. This is who funds this nonviolent activist thing, is Peter Ackerman. Hang on, we're going to talk about him in a sec. Skipping down. He has had, speaking of Mr. Sharp, he has had no contact with the Egyptian protesters, he said. although he recently learned that the Muslim Brotherhood had From Dictatorship to Democracy posted on its website. Mr. Ackerman, who became wealthy as an investment banker after studying under Mr. Sharp, contributed millions of dollars and kept it afloat for years. About a decade ago, Mr. Ackerman wanted to disseminate Mr. Sharp's ideas more aggressively as well as his own. He put his money into his own center, which also produces movies and even a video game to train dissidents. An annuity he purchased still helps pay Mr. Sharp's policy. Now, again, that's Gene Sharp, the nonviolent activist who apparently was one of the ideological founts for these uprisings. One of the interesting things about Mr. Sharp, again, is that he has been financed in considerable measure by Peter Ackerman. Now, Gene Sharp has also been a fellow, had a number of appointments at Harvard University's Center for International Affairs. Now, the founder of that was a fellow named Robert R. Bowie. Robert R. Bowie was deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1977 to 79, when, by the way, the operation to replace the Shah was actually being put into power. And replace him with Khomeini and the Islamists. Again, the October surprise discussions with Farah Mansour are important. It turns out Robert R. Bowie was also the top advisor to John J. McCloy when he was U.S. High Commissioner to Germany in the early 1950s. That is when the Nazi war criminals we've spoken about so often, in particular in conjunction with John Loftus, were brought into our intelligence system. And Robert R. Bowie, who founded the Harvard and Intelligence-Connected think tank, for which apparently Gene Sharp has worked in the past, was John J. McCloy's top advisor and a deputy director of CIA in 77 to 79 when the Shah was being replaced. Now, in For the Record 735, we took a look at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a U.S. government body from SourceWatch. The United States Institute of Peace is an independent, nonpartisan federal institution created and funded by Congress. And again, we've looked at the United States Institute of Peace's Muslim World Initiative and the fact that all this was supposedly intended to bring nonviolent, peaceful Islamists to power. In fact, it appeared to have been using jihadists instead. An advisor to the United States Institute of Peace is, in fact, Peter Ackerman, who was on the U.S. Advisory Council of the United States Institute of Peace. And of Peter Ackerman, who is the guy, this is basically the guy who bankrolls Gene Sharp, who holds forth at Harvard University Center for International Studies, founded by Robert Bowie. Turns out Peter Ackerman has an interesting background as well. Peter Ackerman was born, after talking about where he was born, after his graduation, he joined the junk bond dealers Drexel, Burnham, and Lambert for most of the next 15 years and was the right-hand man to Michael Milken, the junk bond king. He became the key deal maker and strategist for the company, and his innovative approach to deal making, together with his unusual academic qualifications, earned him the nickname the absent-minded professor. So the guy bankrolling this stuff is Michael Milken's right-hand man. Now, that sounds like somebody that the Milton Friedman of the Islamic world might get along with. No, definitely. And by the way, we're told that the AK party in Turkey is something that we should use as a role model. But, we are almost out of time. We're going to talk about that at greater length in For the Record 737. However, the AK party is very, very close to not only the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Bank al-Taqwa and Ahmed Huber. We're going to talk about that, the fact that Hosni Mubarak, just like the Shah, may have had cancer. And we're going to take a look at the spiking oil prices and what that holds for both the U.S. and for the people in the Middle East, many of whom live on $2 a day. And if oil prices spike, food prices are going to spike. You're going to have massive social unrest. And will that lead to Islamic fascism and war all over the Middle East? Who knows? We shall see. However, we are going to have to see, because this concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 736, Taqiyya Sunrise, more about the Piggyback coup in the Middle East. This program is being recorded on March 6th of the year 2011. My name is Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.